Today, we are going to discuss about spiritual urgency, samvega. Buddhism is the teaching of Lord Gautama Buddha, who lived and taught in northern India in the 6th and 5th century before Christ. Buddha was born into a royal family as Prince Siddhartha. He was born in a place called Lumbini in the present-day Nepal. Being a royal prince, he grew up with royal comforts, but he was prevented from seeing any human suffering until he was a young adult. Then he witnessed human suffering in various forms, in the form of old age, illness, and death. And when he knew that this human suffering is common to everybody, can happen to himself, can happen to his loved ones, and that shocked him. And he wanted to find a way out of human suffering. So at the age of 29, he left home and became a homeless ascetic, wanting to find a way out of human suffering. For the next 6 years, he practiced severe austerity and self-mortification, believing that it will bring enlightenment and liberation from suffering. And during those 6 years, he was supported by 5 ascetic companions. Through severe austerity and self-mortification, he became severely emaciated. He nearly died. But it did not bring the enlightenment or liberation of suffering that he was expecting. So he gave it up. And he started meditating under a tree in Bodh Gaya, India. He meditated on in-breath and out-breath, Anapanasati Bhavana. And he was successful. Through meditation, he managed to eradicate all his mental defilements and realize the Four Noble Truths. And he had realized the Four Noble Truths with no assistance from any teacher. So at the age of 35, he became enlightened as a Samma Sambuddha. Having become enlightened as a Samma Sambuddha, the Buddha wanted to teach the doctrine and the path of liberation from suffering to others so that they could also cultivate the same path and liberate themselves from suffering. So he decided to teach his doctrine first to the 5 ascetic companions who had supported him during those 6 years. And they were at that time living in a place called Varanasi in India. Buddha traveled there and delivered his very first sermon called Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, meaning turning of the wheel of truth to the 5 ascetic companions. And the Four Noble Truths that the Buddha had realized are the truth of suffering, dukkha satya, truth of the origin of suffering, samudaya satya, truth of the cessation of suffering, nirodha satya, truth of the path leading to the cessation of suffering, magga satya. So the first noble truth is that there is unavoidable, inevitable, and universal suffering, both physical suffering and mental suffering. The Buddha said, birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, grief, pain, and despair are suffering. Association with what one dislikes is suffering. Separation from what one likes is suffering. Not getting what one desires is suffering. And the Buddha said, in short, the 5 aggregates of clinging are suffering. And the 5 aggregates of clinging are material form, rupa, feeling, vedana, perception, sanya, mental formation, sankhara, and consciousness, vijnana. According to Buddha's teaching, what we call a person or an individual is made up of these 5 factors, 5 aggregates. And Buddha said all these 5 aggregates are nothing but suffering. The second noble truth that the Buddha realized is the cause, origin of suffering. And Buddha named that as craving, tanha. Buddha described 3 types of craving. Craving for sensual pleasures, kama tanha. Craving for becoming, bhava tanha. And craving for non-becoming, vibhava tanha. The third noble truth is that suffering can be completely eradicated, and that is the state of Nibbana. And Buddha said, suffering can be completely eradicated by eradicating craving of all forms. And the fourth noble truth is the path leading to the end of suffering, and that is the Noble Eightfold Path. This Noble Eightfold Path provides practical steps that anyone can cultivate and gain enlightenment and liberation from suffering. There are 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, and they are right view, samadhi, right intention, samma sankappa, right speech, samma vacha, right action, samma kammanta, right livelihood, samma ajiva, right effort, samma vayama, right mindfulness, samma sati, and right concentration, samma samadhi. Now it's 26 centuries since Lord Gautama Buddha passed away, and the Buddha's teaching still exists in the world. And there are many ways and means that we can learn and study the Buddha's teaching. There are teachers, spiritual friends, meditation centers, Buddhist temples that we can approach in order to learn the Buddhist doctrine and practice it. And there is still suffering in the world, perhaps much more suffering than the time that the Buddha lived in India. But when you look around, there are only few people who seem to be practicing the Buddha's teaching. Most of the people seems to be leading quite a meaningless life, running after material gains and sensual pleasures. So something is missing. And what is that? And that is a sense of spiritual urgency that seems to be missing. Now, the Pali word is samvega, and it is translated as agitation, fear, anxiety, thrill, and religious emotion caused by contemplating the miseries of this world. There is no English word that can reflect the exact meaning of the Pali word samvega. So in the Buddhist literature, it's usually translated as spiritual urgency. Now, what is spiritual urgency? It's a sort of profound and complex emotional reaction associated with a sense of shock and dismay that can come when one realizes the futility of this meaningless life that one is living at the present time. And the spiritual urgency can develop suddenly, triggered by a particular life experience. It could be one's own serious or terminal illness, the death of a loved one, or some form of emotional trauma, an accident, natural disasters, or even when one witnesses suffering all around in the world, one may develop spiritual urgency. It can also gradually develop when one starts reflecting on this endless cycle of birth, old age, sickness, and death that we are faced with, and also the possibility of being born even in the worlds of extreme suffering during our journey in the cycle of birth and death, the samsara. Spiritual urgency can also develop through meditation, especially when one starts meditating on universal characteristics of all physical and mental phenomena, such as impermanence, anicca, suffering, dukkha, and lack of any substantiality, anatta. When spiritual urgency develops, it may create an urge, an urgency, and motivation to do something in order to get out of this cycle of birth and death with all its associated suffering. In some people, when spiritual urgency develops, there's a tendency to blame oneself, to be angry with oneself or one's own existence, which are not really helpful. One can see three aspects of spiritual urgency. First, a sense of shock and dismay when one understands the futility and meaninglessness of life as it is normally lived by oneself. Secondly, one may feel a sense of guilt, remorse, or failure for being complacent and foolish enough to let oneself live such a meaningless life. And then finally, a sense of urgency in trying to find a way out of this meaningless existence. Now, if a layperson develops spiritual urgency, they might decide to search, learn, and practice a particular spiritual path in order to get out of suffering. One may distance oneself from this meaningless materialistic life and also change one's priorities in life and lifestyle. And they will also begin to associate more and more with others who got similar inclinations. And once they have studied and learned a particular doctrine, they will start a spiritual practice, maybe on their own at home or in groups. And some of the lay people may even enter monastic life so that they can practice the path of liberation on a full-time basis. And if spiritual urgency develops in monastic, they will decide to practice harder with more effort, more diligence, and perseverance in order to attain the spiritual goal. The greatest example of spiritual urgency, of course, what happened to Prince Siddhartha, the Buddha aspirant. When he was born, some wise men predicted that one day he's going to leave his domestic life to become a homeless ascetic and eventually will become a Samma Sambuddha. And that worried his father, King Suddhodana. And he wanted to make sure that his son will not witness any form of suffering. Because if he saw suffering, the father thought that he might be disenchanted with the domestic life and become an ascetic. So he was kept away from any human suffering outside their palace. But when he was a young adult, he was exposed to human suffering in the form of old age, illness, and death. And that shocked and alarmed him. And he became disenchanted. And he decided to find a way out of human suffering. And because that could not be done living as a householder, he renounced his royal domestic life and became a homeless ascetic. Now let us see whether we can find few things from the Buddha's discourses that might help one to develop spiritual urgency. In a discourse called Thana Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, that is the collection of the Buddha's numerical discourses, the Buddha described 5 things that one should contemplate on everyday basis. And the 5 things are: I am subject to aging. I have not gone beyond aging. I am subject to illness. I have not gone beyond illness. I am subject to death. I have not gone beyond death. I will grow different and separate from all that is dear and appealing to me. And I am the owner of my all actions, and I have to bear the consequences of my own actions. In another discourse called Devaduta Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha described the old age, sickness, and death as three divine messengers. And the Buddha advised us to contemplate, I too am liable to grow old. I am not exempt from old age. I would better do good by way of body, speech, and mind. I too am liable to become sick. I am not exempt from sickness. I had better do good by way of body, speech, and mind. I too am liable to die. I am not exempt from death. I better do good by way of body, speech, and mind. In another discourse called Somanatta Sutta of the Itivuttaka, that's one of the 15 books of Kuddaka Nikaya, the collection of the Buddha's minor discourses. The Buddha has said that when two factors are present, a monk has a mental ease and will make an effort to eradicate all mental defilements. And those two factors are feeling spiritual urgency from those that can create that feeling, and also making the right effort to feel spiritual urgency. There's another discourse called Araka Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, where the Buddha described a religious teacher in the past named Araka. Now, this religious teacher named Araka was addressing his disciples, and he was saying, this life as a human being is short, brief, fleeting, filled with pain and suffering. So one should think about this and wake up. And one should do what is skillful and live the spiritual life, because no one who is born is free from death. And the Buddha said then in that discourse that when this Araka religious teacher was talking about a short life, the lifespan was 60,000 years. And the same religious leader used 7 common phenomena to show how short and brief the human life is. He compared the human life to a dewdrop, to a water bubble, to a line drawn in the water, to a fast flowing river from a mountain, to a glob of spit on the tongue, to a piece of meat on a heated iron pot, and to a cow on its way to the slaughterhouse, all with a very short space of life. In another sutta called Salla Sutta of the Sutta Nipata, that's also in the Kuddaka Nikaya, collection of the Buddha's minor discourses, the Buddha was speaking to an acutely bereaved father who has lost his only son. And the Buddha said, unindicated and unknown is the length of life. There is no means by which those who are born will not die. Just as with ripe fruits, with the constant danger that they will fall, just as the pots made by a potter all end by being broken, in the same way, for those born and subject to death, there is always the possibility of dying. Now let us see how else we can help ourselves to develop a sense of spiritual urgency. Meditation by reflecting on death might help. And this death meditation is one of 40 meditation objects. And it's also one of 4 protective meditations. In several discourses, for example, in the Pratama and Dutiya Maranasuti Suttas of the Anguttara Nikaya, Buddha has described the value of meditating on death. One can die from any number of causes, but no one knows when, where, and how one is going to die. And there is no place to hide from death. And there is no one who can protect us from death. Now, birth as a human being is an extremely rare event. And Buddha said that in several discourses. In Nakasika Sutta of the Samvega Nikaya, that's a collection of the Buddha's connected discourses. The Buddha used the simile of a little soil in a fingertip. The Buddha picked a little soil on one of the fingertips and asked the monks, what is larger, the soil on my fingertip or the soil in this great earth? And the monks, of course, said, Sir, the soil on your fingertip is minute compared to the vast earth. And Buddha said, monks, similarly, those beings who will be reborn as human beings is so minute like the soil on my fingertip. The vast majority of them, similar to the great earth, will be reborn in the worlds of suffering. And the Buddha used another simile in the discourse called Patama Chiggala Yuga Sutta. And there Buddha used the simile of the blind turtle and a piece of wood with the hole. Buddha said, there is a blind turtle at the bottom of the ocean, and there's a piece of wood with the hole floating on the surface of the ocean. Once in 100 years, this blind turtle happens to come to the surface. And he asked the monks, how possible is it for the blind turtle to put his neck through the hole of that piece of wood? And the monk said, it's extremely rare. And then the Buddha said, to be born as a human being again is even rarer than that. And when we are born in any of the lower suffering worlds, there is no opportunity to do good deeds or practice any Dhamma. In another discourse called Dutiya Chiggala Yuga Sutta, again of the Samyutta Nikaya, Buddha said, it's very rare to gain a human birth. And it's also very rare for a Buddha to appear in the world. And it is extremely rare for the Buddha's teaching to be available. And the Buddha advised the monks, now that all three are present, practice the path of liberation with diligence. So we are in a treasured moment right now. We are born as human beings, which is an extremely rare event. And we are born in an eon in which Lord Gautama Buddha was born and taught the path of liberation from suffering. And we are born with no serious disabilities, and we are intelligent enough to understand the Buddha's teaching. And the Buddha's teaching is freely available. We can read it, we can listen to discourses, engage in discussions, and there are Buddhist temples and meditation centers where we can access the Buddha's teaching and practice. And there are teachers, mentors, spiritual friends who are willing to help us. And there are Buddhist temples and meditation centers that we can access and practice. So it is up to all of us to develop a sense of spiritual urgency and try to take the maximum advantage of this great opportunity by practicing the Buddhist path of liberation and liberate ourselves from suffering and the cycle of birth and death, samsara. Thank you very much.